just takes a moment.
Good evening. Welcome everyone to our April 9th special board budget meeting. I'd like to start us off in a good way by recognizing and acknowledging both the Esquimalt and the Songhees nations on whose traditional territories we live, we learn, and we do our work. Trustees, may I have a mover to approve this evening's agenda? I know we have one amendment to consider, but thank you, Trustee Gagnon, for moving the agenda. Trustee Mabobi is a seconder. Trustee Kwan, did you want to move that amendment?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. Yeah, I just noticed that we were remiss on leaving a question period for public off of the end of our agenda. So I'm hoping that we can add that. Sorry, and I'm remote. I'm actually in the car right now taking the meeting, so I don't have the agenda up at the same time as the Zoom meeting. So if someone can remind me, perhaps maybe the best spot to put it as far as letters and numbers go.
Yeah. My suggestion it would become the new D, so it would come just before adjournment.
I'm fine with that, unless there's any other objection.
Thank you, Trustee Kwan. May I have a seconder? So it's just to clarify. Thank you, Trustee Bio. So it's just to add a question period to our agenda, and it'll become the new D. Any discussion? We're gonna vote on we're gonna call a vote on the amendments to the agenda first. Any discussion in relation to adding a question period? All right, hearing none. All those in favor of adding question period to the agenda? And opposed? Abstentions?
Apologies, Chair. I'm in favor. Couldn't get the video going.
No problem. Okay, so I believe, Trustee David, would you mind just indicating your vote? I didn't get your vote.
I'm in favor.
Thank you. Okay, so that is unanimous. All right, so we have an amended agenda. I'm just going to call the question subject to any other further amendments that someone might want to move. Okay, seeing none, all those in favor of the amended agenda with a show of hands, trustees. And that is unanimous. Thank you, folks. Okay, so we don't have any community presentations this evening. We do have a correspondence section under B1. So you'll find correspondence that we received in relation to the budget. Does anybody want to pull anything from B1 for discussion? Okay, trustees, then we'll move on to our 2024-2025 annual budget reports. So we have a report under C1 through C4. Secretary Treasurer, would you like to walk us through those reports?
Thank you, Chair. I know we don't have a huge amount of time this evening, so I'll just provide a quick summary of the two reports that are included in the agenda package. The first one is from our Talking Tables event that was held on March 7th. We had 48 participants attending that event. And during that event, we did have dinner, but the focus on that event was to have a diverse group of people around each table and then talk about certain topics that can be tied back to the budget. Hoping to hear from all of the parties around what are priorities for the upcoming year. So included in with that report is the agenda from the event, also the presentation slides, and the notes that were collected from all of the facilitators that were at each of the tables. And do you want me to just move on to the next one?
I'm just thanks for pausing there. I want to look to the group to see if anyone has any questions in relation to the Talking Tables report. Not seeing any hands, so thank you, Secretary Treasurer. If you want to move on to the public meeting report under C2, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Okay. So we held a public meeting on March 14th. It was in person at the gym at Spectrum. We had 53 participants. 29 of them were members of the public, and the remainder were either trustees or employees of the school district. At that public meeting, we had provided, I think there were 5 different topics that we wanted to get feedback on from the public. And so at each of the tables, there was also a note taker and recorded as much as possible the conversation that happened at the table around the priority topics that were chosen. So included in the agenda package, you will see the presentation slide. So there's a short presentation at the start, the package that was provided to the public, and also all of the transcribed notes from each of the tables. And then at the very end, we also had comment cards. So each participant was able to leave some comments, their kind of top 3 priorities for the board's consideration, and those are included in the agenda package as well.
Thank you very much, Secretary Treasurer. Again, folks, did anyone have any questions in relation to that public meeting report? Okay, thank you very much, Secretary Treasurer. We are now at C3, so this is the values and guiding principles. Secretary Treasurer, was there anything in that document that you wanted to highlight?
I didn't really want to highlight anything. It's more just to provide information as to what is guiding the board in its budget decisions. The values and guiding principles were approved by the board on January 29th, 2024. So just so for information, really.
Thank you very much. Okay, so maybe without further ado, I'll move us into C4. So this is our annual budget memo for 2024-2025. And again, I'll turn the floor over to the Secretary Treasurer.
Thank you, Chair. I actually have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to run through, so I'll just share my screen.
Sounds great, thanks.
What I'll also mention too, because it's difficult for me to see if anyone has any questions, I'm going to pretty much cover off the rest of the items that are on the agenda. We'll end up at budget deliberations. And I thought maybe before we move into that, if there's any questions around the memo or the multi-year financial forecast, you're welcome to ask them at the end, if that works okay.
Sounds good. If there's anything urgent, then folks can just indicate and I'll acknowledge you.
Sounds good. So I have a few different things to go through this evening. I'll try to be quickly run through them because I know what we really want to get to is the current year budget and how we will be addressing the deficit that we're in right now. One thing that I think is really important to mention is that in this budget process and in the values and guiding principles that I just referred to, there is a section called alignment. And what it says is that all of the budget decisions that are made will align to the district's strategic plan, goals, and strategies. And it's now called the Enhancing Student Learning Report. So that priority will be given to strategic plan and enhancing student learning initiatives, and will make financial connections to complete the financial report. And then a comment that the organization recognizes constraint and the ability to do many things, but not all things. So we do have a strategic plan. It's a one-page document. You can find it on the district website. Includes our mission, vision. We have 3 goals with 3 to 4 strategies for each goal, plus our core values. The Enhancing Student Learning Report is a report that we create annually. Is linked back to the goals and strategies that are in the strategic plan. And it contains all of the actions that are being taken to achieve our goals in the areas of literacy, numeracy, human and social development, and career development. It does have a focus on our priority students, which are Indigenous students, students with disabilities or diverse abilities, and children and youth in care. So the budget process this year is a little bit different than what we did last year. We had in-person meetings with student representatives from all of the secondary schools. That's with members of senior leadership and trustees. Same thing, in-person meetings with representatives from partner groups and the VPVPA. As to meetings with representative from the 4 houses, the Director of Indigenous Education, the Associate Secretary Treasurer, and myself were able to meet with all of them to talk about the budget and how they would like to participate. This year, we moved forward with 3 smaller budget working groups instead of a large budget advisory committee, and there were meetings held between December and February. There was a student symposium event on January 11th, the Talking Tables event and public meeting as mentioned, and which brings us to tonight and also Thursday night, where we will review the budget and the board will deliberate. So as per public sector accounting standards, the board is required to create a budget that encompasses all of our funds. So that's the operating, special purpose, and capital fund. Also, as per legislation, the board must approve a balanced budget. However, it is permitted to use unspent operating budget from the prior year to balance. We are in a cyclical budget cycle, and in February, we submitted our enrollment projections to the ministry for 24-25. They gave us our funding announcement in March, and we are now here looking for board approval of the annual budget. So just some key dates include tonight, we're hoping to get to the first and second readings of the budget bylaw. Thursday, we're looking for the second and third, or the third. And then pretty much right away, the staffing packages will be sent out to schools, so April 15th, and we'll have them back before the end of April. So this table that we're looking at, this is the enrollment, and the ministry operating grant funded FTEs are expected to increase by 186.108 for the budget in 24-25, and that's compared to the amended annual budget in 23-24. The enrollment is expected to increase by 81.861 between 24-25 and 25 and 26, and then a further 40.638 between 25-26 and 26-27. The graph that you see here is just showing that to you visually. If you prefer to see numbers in graphs, you can see just a slight increase in enrollment over the next few years. The table that is here shows you the breakdown of the school-aged enrollment. It also includes the detailed breakdown of funding for unique student needs. That includes inclusive education. The ministry still refers to that as special needs. English language learners, also referred to as ELL, and Indigenous education. And we've included on there our estimates for international student enrollment in the regular program. This table here shows you the funding levels per FTE from last year to this year, the increase. Most of the levels increased by 3.4%. This increase is directly tied to labor settlements, which includes wage increases for teachers, support staff, and non-educator exempt positions. And just to explain what a non-educator exempt position is, those are the exempt positions that you would find in departments like HR, IT, facilities, financial service, and it also includes the secretary treasurer. So what it doesn't include is principals, vice principals, or the other members of the senior leadership team, the superintendent, associate superintendents. So if we look at operating revenue, I'm just going to summarize some of the larger variances. So first of all, the provincial grants, Ministry of Education and Childcare, our revenue is up 15.7 million. It's actually up 15.9 million, but there is an offset for the LEA agreements that we have by 200,000. Just highlighting the bigger items within that increase. We saw 5 million increase for an increase in enrollment and another 6 million in increase in per student funding. And then the next largest one is 3.4 million increase in inclusive learning. I'll also mention too that included in there for the first time is funding of 69,000 for Indigenous Education Councils, which is something that is just new in the coming year. Under the line of tuition, there's just a $5,000 decrease. That's due to a decrease in international education enrollment, but it is offset by a tuition increase. So it's going up $500. It's actually going up $1,000. 500 was announced previously, and then more recently, anyone enrolling after March 31st has an additional $500 per FTE increase. The other revenue is up by 1.1 million. That's where you will see the LEA agreement in there at 0.2 million, and the rest is international fee forfeitures, homestay fees, and activity fees. Rentals and leases are up by 0.2 million, and that's as a result of an increase to the license to occupy fees that we charge to our out-of-school care providers in our out-of-school care. And investment income is up by 0.3. So we have in 24-25, we'll have more funds held in the central deposit program with the ministry. And that's partially offset with a decrease in interest rates. So our current interest rate is 5.2%. We are anticipating that that will decrease. We have a decrease of 0.25% on July 1 and another 0.25 decrease on January 1, 2025. This just shows you visually our total operating revenue and how it's broken out. So you could see that most of it is coming to us through provincial grants. And moving on to operating expenses, they're up 11 million in salaries. And I'll just highlight that there are wage increases that are built into the 24-25 budget. For GVTA, there's a 2% increase. There's also a 0.11% increase to the top step, as well as regular step increases. For QP 947, there's a 2% increase. QP 382, also 2%. And under exempt, it's broken out into two pieces. So we have the non-educator exempt. There's a 2% and regular step increases included. But for administrators in leadership roles, it's just the regular step increases. I'll explain a little bit more in a minute. Trustees, we have an increase of 3.17%, and that would be effective January 1, 2025. So in relation to the wage increases, the labor settlement funding for the 2% increase, we've received that for teachers, support staff, and non-educator exempt staff. It's included in the operating grant. Also included in the operating grant is any labor settlement funding related to the prior year. They roll it in to the operating grant in the following year. There will be a special grant announced for 2% for administrators and leadership roles pending PSEC approval. So that 2% increase has not been built into the budget. Once we receive that funding announcement, we will build both the revenue and the expenses in the budget for that group. The Ministry of Finance did announce that the COLA, which is the cost of living adjustment, is 1%. They haven't announced their grant related to that yet. So we have not included the 1% COLA increase or the revenue for any of the employee groups. Oh, I went to one slide ahead. Let's see, go back. There we go. Okay, so benefits, employee benefits are up by 4 million. There is a component of benefits that's wage sensitive, so those will automatically increase as wages increase. And then we're also aware of some other increases in our benefit premiums and statutory deductions. And also the CPP contribution limit was increased. So these are additional expenses for next year. Under services and supplies, we have an increase of just under 3 million, and it's coming from a variety of areas. Services is the largest of them. It's 1.8 million. And that's 0.2 million is coming from legal fees, 0.3 million from software maintenance. So this is software that we are already using, and they have annual increases that we basically need to pay because we need to continue to use the software. 0.1 million increase in digital services. That's the network that's provided through the ministry. There's also a 0.9 million in agent fees and ISP, and it's actually it reflects as a higher number because last year when we did the budget, there was a large reduction that was made around labor settlement, and all of it was taken out of agent fees until we knew where the reductions.
Sorry, Secretary Treasurer, I think you're frozen. Certainly on my end you are.
Can you hear me?
Oh, I can now. Yeah.
Okay.
Everyone, are we now able to hear Secretary Treasurer? Can I get a thumbs up from folks if you can hear Secretary Treasurer's right? Okay, good. It's not just me, so go ahead.
I'll keep going. We've lost our group connection, but I had one going here just in case. So keep moving along.
Sounds good.
No. Oh, it's okay. Unless so just jumping back into services, there's just a couple more items there. 60,000 portable moves is an increase, and that was because there was a one-time reduction last year. And then 81,000 we had to increase due to an increase in bank service charges, and that's tied directly to the increased use of School Cash Online. Student transportation is up by 0.1 million, and that's related to the International Student Program, their short-term programs. Dues and fees show an increase of 80,000, but that's just a timing around a board motion around the BCSTA membership. It was originally removed and then put back. And then insurance is up by 0.1 million, which is an increase in the SPP premiums, the school protection program. That's who insures us. And then in supplies, we've seen an increase of 0.6 million. There was a slight increase of 0.1 million for custodial supplies, and that's due to increases in the cost of the actual supplies. There's a food increase that's tied to an increase in cafeteria revenue of 75,000. And then instructional supplies are up 0.3 million, and that's directly tied to the increase in enrollment, and also some consumables in pathways and partnerships. And utilities is up by 0.3 million, and that is due to rate increases. This slide here just shows you the breakdown of our operating expenses. You can see that our budget is 91.8% made up of salaries and benefits, and everything else falls into that 8.2%. This table that we're looking at now is the operating expenses.
Thank you.
We have a bit of an echo going on here.
You do, yeah. Did you want to perhaps try to rejoin? I know you've turned off your
We're
camera.
just going to keep going with the way it was here. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, the echo has stopped and we can hear you again. Go ahead.
Yes, so this table just shows the operating expenses broken down by what's called function. You can see that it just shows like where the most of our budget is sitting, and of the 18 million increase in expenses, 15 million of that is under the category of instruction. And this is just a visual of that breakdown. So 85.3% of our budget is in instruction, 2.9% in district admin, 11.2% in operations and maintenance, and then 0.6% in transportation. And we like to show this slide. It just shows where the district is with those percentages compared to the provincial average. So they take all school districts and that's the average. Slide here is the projected deficit for 24-25. The deficit is actually 6 million, but because we are projecting a surplus at the end of the current year of just over 1.8 million, that reduces our deficit down to 4.1 million. Last year, we were looking at a deficit of 3.8 after applying a surplus appropriation of 2.2 million. Now we're just looking at where we end up at the end of the year in a surplus position. And this graph just shows you over the last 10 years, kind of how we had some pretty large surpluses in past years. And more recent years, you see that surplus declining down. This is our estimate for accumulated operating surplus at the end of the year. Projected surplus is to be around 5 million. Last year it was 6.8. And you can see here the 1.8 million that we've earmarked to help offset the deficit 24-25. And also the contingency that we have right now of 617. Everything else that's in that list, we would consider internally restricted. I will just mention too that the board does have a policy around operating surplus. And based on a ministry directive to hold a reasonable contingency just to mitigate risk. The recommendation is to hold between 2 to 4%, which would be a range of 4.59 million to 9.18 million. Our current contingency is at 0.27%, just over 600,000. I just mentioned local capital reserves. In prior years, we've been able to use local capital to help offset capital asset purchases, which allows us to have more operating budget available. Right now in our local capital reserve, we have a small amount that's 100% allocated to amenities at Vic High. Once that's allocated, there's no more local capital available. Now we're moving into the budget balancing recommendation. So I'm just going to go through, just read through the items that are on here. I'm sure that this is probably where a lot of questions will be. So either interrupt me if you want to ask one right away, or I'll just go through and then we can come back and revisit these. So, first section is reductions ongoing. The first one is student device ratio reduced from 2.1 to 3.1 at middle and secondary, and from 2.1 to 4.1 at elementary. And elementary allocations will be based on creating parity among schools, just over 600,000. Historic support for low enrolling trades class, which is equivalent of 1 block at secondary school, 19,000. In the inclusive learning budget, to remove a contingency that's been in there. It has historically not been used. We can have a contingency from enrollment growth or hold back funds during the allocation process until enrollment is actually realized. So this is 77,000. Also in inclusive learning, a reduction of 1.6 FTE non-enrolling teachers, not at priority schools. And this would bring us, bring our teacher FTE closer to the contractual ratio, savings of 206,000. Again, in inclusive learning, reducing the number of EA positions that already do not fill, 250,000. At school cash online, this is moving to a value-based pricing. It's a model where parents pay a transaction fee that's built into the price. The savings of around 216,000. A reduction of interest earned by schools on non-public funds. So this is interest that we earn on balances that schools are holding. We would allocate them essentially half of the interest that we earn, 133,000. Counseling reduction of an unfilled district 1.0 position, and then 0.1 FTE at 4 elementary schools. So that's a total of 1.4 FTE for 189,000. The link currently at Lambert Park, it's operating in a deficit. So we'd be looking to homeschools that receive the enrollment funding for the students attending that program to provide necessary funding to support their students when they're at the link, 40,000. Emergency preparedness to centralize purchases and reduce spending, 25,000. GVTA Pro D, reduction of 25,000 that has historically been allocated. Reason being that there's a larger increase in Pro D funding to the GVTA through the new collective agreement. TTOC costs historically paid for by the district. So we're moving from district funding TTOC replacement to Indigenous Education Department funded TTOC replacement. Still over 8,000. A reduction of 12,500 for the Indigenous grad focus course. This is Pro D. course was supported last year, and we now have 2 provincially trained trainers who can support schools in 24-25. In information technology, looking at a managed print strategy, cost reduction initiative. This is all of our copiers in schools and departments. This initiative would result in less printing and an increased number of service years for print devices, savings of 50,000. Tolme Building Mail Services have moved to a new mail service and will look to a reduction in postage, 3,000. Human Resource Services, there's a vacant position, manager labor relations, that would be eliminated, just over 151,000. And quite a few different supplies reductions you'll see here at varying percentages. Schools would see at all levels would see a total of almost 553,000 reduction. International ed, 115,000. Trustees, just over 12. Superintendent's office, 2,500. Deputy associate superintendents, just over 3,000. Interesting, 800. Secretary treasurer's office, 1,300. Facility services, 5,500. Financial services, 5,000. HR, 6,000. Information technology, just over 5,000. Ecologists, just over 9,000. Inclusive learning administration, just over 3,000. And inclusive learning itinerant, 1,300. And the last 3 items on the reduction are permanent reductions, leveled support supplies at 4,000, and pathways and partnerships at 4,000, and a sewing machine repair budget of 2,000. This budget hasn't been used in the last few years because schools are already paying for their own repairs. That's 2,000. That's all of the ongoing reductions. And then we move into one-time reductions. So these would be implemented just for the 24-25 year, and then they would be added back. So the aviation program, we've had a teacher retire. So this program is going to be paused for a year for a savings of 45,000. Number of one-time savings in facility services, including maintenance painters, 2.0 FTE. They've retired, and so the positions will be unfilled for 1 year, 190,000. Won't be annual window cleaning for 1 year. Usually we would clean 1/3 of the schools each year, 9,000. A portion of vehicle leases, they have staggered renewal dates, and so they would hold off on that, saving 46,000. There are 2 positions that would move to capital, the Tech 2 position, a 1.0, and half of the paint 4-person. The tech is 99,000, and the paint 4-person is almost 52,000. In addition to that, paint supplies would be moved to AFG for 1 year. That's a 2% reduction, almost 19,000. And carpentry supplies also moved to AFG, 2% reduction, just about 41,000 there. And there's also a partial temporary leave of absence that won't be filled for 1 year, and that's just under 47,000. And now we're coming to a section that's called shifts in practice, ongoing. And what that means is that it's usually something that we're already doing, or we might be stopping it, but in doing that, it creates space within that budget, which allows us to move operating expenses out of operating and into special purpose funds, which creates surplus in the operating fund, which we can use to help balance the budget. The first one on the list is Deputy Associate Superintendent. There's a Senior Management Assistant and there'll be a partial reallocation of that position to the Feeding Futures program, 37,000. Pathways and Partnerships has been paying for cafeteria assistance in operating, and that can now be moved to Feeding Futures, 86,000. A Community Link, there's a behavior interventionist will be reallocated to inclusive learning. Reduce Gay Straight Alliance, the 9,000. And reallocate Pisces physical literacy, 60,000. Reallocate Compass stabilization, 15,000. Do social emotional learning mental health support, 5,000. Allocate the cost of living adjustment for YFCs to come from the school's community link funding, just over 15,000. And then reduce a temporary TTOC report to support 2 elementary schools, under 11,000. And reduce an enrollment contingency of just under 35,000. Critical incidents report team, we would reallocate those costs from operating to Community Link, 3,500. 0.20 of the district principal multi-language learners would be reallocated to the ELL budget, 39,000. And district ukulele, there's 2 sources of staffing for this program, so we would remove the duplicate staffing. It doesn't impact the FTE at all, just under 11,000. Category is shifts in practice one time. So this is an anticipated surplus at the end of the current year, 120,000, which can be used to fund some expenses that are currently in operating. There's a shift in practice reallocation. So the first line here is removing elementary strings. And the second line is adding back an elementary strings hub model, which would be 14 hubs, 2 45-minute classes per week. Net of those 2 items is 137,000. And then we have a couple of additions as well, ongoing additions. So we have a guaranteed EA relief position. This is a pilot at one of the priority schools for half a year, 35,000. And then also additional EA mentorship FTE to assist with EA skills development and support for EAs in middle schools. Also 35,000. We're almost there. Additions, revenues. If we limit when schools can block off rental space, we can see an increase of 15,000 in spring rental revenue. And also we are budgeting for crossing guard revenue from the district of Saanich, equivalent to the funding shortfall that currently exists. And lastly, you can see the 1.8 million that we would be using out of the surplus. Part of that 50,000 is there was a restriction on total amount that schools could carry forward at the end of the year. And that was put in place last year. We'll continue with that for 1 more year. And with all of those adjustments, we can balance the budget to 0.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. If that is the end of the slide deck for now, do we want to pause here, or did you want to continue through a multi-year financial forecast memo and worksheet before we open the floor for questions or discussion around the information you presented so far? What would you prefer?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say on the multi-year, and I'll just explain the budget bylaw. So yeah, I'll continue through and then I can stop sharing my screen so we can see each other again.
Okay, thanks.
So included in the agenda package is a multi-year financial forecast. It includes the actual results from last year, the amended annual budget in the current year, and then the projected budgets for the next 3 years. And the projected budgets have been adjusted for the projected enrollment. So what we submitted to the ministry in February for those years. And we've adjusted both the revenue and the related expenses. You will notice in the multi-year financial forecast right now that we've kept it unbalanced. So none of the proposed balancing strategies have been incorporated into the forecast. But as soon as any decisions are made by the board, we would update the forecast to reflect those changes. And anything that I read out that was on the list that is ongoing, you will see that come off in the future years' structural deficit. Here you can see that 4.1 million, that's the deficit that we're looking at right now. And then the deficits for the next 2 years are just under 6 million and 5.5 million. The other thing you don't see in those two, the last two future years is using accumulated surplus from the prior year. We're only able to project out what might be at the end of this year. And so that's that 1.8 million, but it's really challenging to try to look any further ahead than that. So included in the ministry template, you will see a schedule that has more detail than what is here. This is a summary of all of our special purpose funds. This is the revenue. But in our special purpose funds, the revenue that we recognize is equivalent to the expenses. Just highlight, we did receive increased ministry funding for the Classroom Enhancement Fund, also referred to as CEF, and Student and Family Affordability Fund. We received increased ministry funding for CEF staffing and Community Link for labor settlement. And we've also indicated an increase in school generated funds revenue, and that's based on the activity in the current year, so anticipating that that will continue, and also higher interest revenue. And lastly, the capital fund. So the major changes in the capital fund are an increase in investment income of 61,000, and that's due to higher interest rates. You'll see an increase of 3.8 million in local capital due to anticipated gain on disposal of land at Lansdowne North to CSF. We're budgeting for the purchase of tangible capital assets from the operating fund of 2.9 million, and that's made up mostly of technology and network infrastructure and some furniture and equipment. And then also 100,000 from special purpose funds. I just want to note that this table that you're seeing on your screen right now matches the number that's in the draft ministry template that's also in the agenda package. That's the unbalanced budget. If we were to make all of the adjustments that were presented, so all of the balancing initiatives, the budget bylaw would be 318,006,345. And we would need to use the 1,897,592 anticipated surplus at the end of the year in order to balance. So when you get to the budget bylaws, it's this number here on the balanced sheet that will be in the bylaw motions, not the one that's reflected on the ministry template, so not the unbalanced. Like that. And just a reminder that we do have another meeting scheduled for Thursday at 6 o'clock. And I will pass it back over to you, Chair.
Right, thank you very much, Secretary Treasurer Stride. I want to just pause before we get into our deliberations, just to once again thank you and your team for all the hard work to prepare us and get us to this point. I want to first hold some space for some questions. Questions about your memo and questions about the balancing recommendations worksheet. So why don't we start there? So I'm going to open the floor to questions. Trustee Painter, kick us off.
Thank you, Chair. I was actually going to ask if we wanted to provide an opportunity for partners to ask their questions before the trustees get into it.
I think I'm just going to open the floor to everybody, partners and trustees included. Yeah, so I think just partners around the table. If you do have questions, then just please indicate with your hand, either your actual hand or your virtual hand, and I'll call on you. So Trustee Painter, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And what I want to begin with expressing my appreciation to district staff and our financial staff in particular for the work of getting us to this point. It's no mean feat considering the many demands that we have on budget to be able to develop something that is as close to the mark as it is. And I recognize that the questions that I have right now don't even add up to a rounding error in the overall budget. Having said that, we're in a situation where every dollar matters, and I really need to feel confident about how we're allocating our resources. On page 236, this is part of the memo. There was mention of a counseling reduction, moving a number of schools to 0.4 FTE. There was mention in the memo of this being tied to ratios, but what isn't mentioned in that is that this was actually a deliberate decision made by a prior board in my first term to go to a base plus model, which meant that we would have at least 0.5 FTE counseling in all of our elementary schools. And the purpose for that was that one of the keys to any counseling success is relationship. That our counseling staff have to be present in the schools to develop the rapport, to become known and trusted adults before they can ever hope to be able to effectively deliver their services. So in the absence of evidence that these schools aren't making full use of their counseling services, I'm really struggling with the idea of any school going below 0.5, and for reasons I've already mentioned. If there's a question in there, is it possible to get information about the caseloads for counseling in our schools so that we can better understand what the demands are and where there are gaps? And then one other, and I realize that's not a question we can answer right now, so I'll leave that. The one other one is page 237 of the budget, and I do apologize in advance if this is somewhere else in the agenda package. I did try to look for it, wasn't successful. The community link, there's mention in a number of locations that programs and projects that were previously funded through Community Link have been reduced to make space for operational funding that is going to be transferred in. But I wasn't able to find the details about those operational funds. And I've raised this point previously that I really need to be able to pass the red face test and know that the funding in Community Link, which is a special purpose fund, is actually meeting the goals of that program. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Painter. Secretary Treasurer, I wonder if, or indeed Superintendent Witten, if you want to maybe shed some light on first the point for reduction at the 4 elementary schools. To the extent that information is available to assist Trustee Painter.
Thank you, through the chair. I think as Trustee Painter has acknowledged, it probably isn't something that we can answer now. What we would be looking at, certainly to be able to provide for Thursday, is that accounting of the schools and the FTE that are in these schools. Caseloads would probably not be possible to provide, but we certainly could provide the student population or the FTE of the schools for elementary schools.
Thank you, Superintendent. And then in terms of any of the recommended balancing items that have to do with moving current operational expenditure into Community Link, are we able to again just go through some of those and maybe provide a little bit more context and explanation?
Yes, for the Community Link ones, what we were thinking is that we have teacher counselors that are in the operating fund, and counseling does meet the criteria required by Community Link. And so I think for simplicity's sake and to ensure that we're transferring expenses over that are eligible for that funding, we would move over the equivalent dollar value of counselors from operating to Community Link.
Secretary Treasurer, could you just clarify, because I think it may not be 100% obvious to everyone who's maybe our lay people and not as familiar with budgeting, but would you mind just confirming that there isn't a reduction in relation to those items, but rather the expenditure is being moved from operating into the special purpose fund, which in this case is Community Link, because I think it might come across as though there is going to be an overall reduction to what it is we're funding.
Just to be clear, there are some items that are in Community Link right now that would come off, so they would be reduced. But by moving counselors from operating into Community Link is not a reduction. It's just shifting their funding source. But what it does is, and we did this last year, what it does is by moving those expenses out of operating and into Community Link where we've created space, the budget is still sitting in operating, but the expenses are no longer there. So we can make a reduction. It creates a surplus in operating that we can use to offset the deficit. So we can make a reduction then in operating because those expenses are no longer there.
Does that help, Trustee Painter, in terms of understanding the impacts of those recommended items and what funding is?
Thanks. It does assist. Thank you.
Okay. Trustee McNally, go ahead.
Thank you. Is this an appropriate place to just state a concern or a deep concern with one of the items?
I think at this point I wanted to just have us focused on questions and clarification, and then we as trustees will go into our deliberations where then we'll have an opportunity to speak to our concerns or the extent to which we support certain things or don't support other things. So if you wouldn't mind just bearing with us as we kind of seek clarification. Thank you, Trustee McNally. I appreciate it. Okay, I'm not seeing hands in terms, oh, there we go. Good evening. Hi, Tina. Nice to see you. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hi there. Just a clarification on page 240, the line about the link currently operating at a deficit. And then Secretary Treasurer Stride mentioned the program at Lambrick. Under my impression, there are two different programs. To me, the link is the DL portion, and the link at Lambrick is a separate program that I think is funded on alt funding. So I just wanted to clarify that those are two different things, or maybe I misunderstand.
No, thanks for the question. Appreciate it. Secretary Treasurer or perhaps Superintendent Whitten, are you able to clarify that?
I think the link we're referring to the funding that is not altered, so it is specifically the that funding that you first referenced. So alt-ed is not included in that.
Okay.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Hi, Cindy. Go ahead when you're ready.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I just have a question about the string hubs, about how that program will be implemented, if it will be happening during school, before, after school, and have we thought about how to transport kids? I wasn't sure about that.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Superintendent Whitten, and then maybe I'll just pop in here just to give some context in terms of process. So we are at our meeting on Thursday going to have a series of motions, two of which will speak to music recommendations. So I just wanted to put a placeholder so everyone knows to expect that 11th of April agenda will include motions, two of which relate to music. But I then want to turn the floor over to the superintendent or to Secretary Treasurer. You might want to add further context.
Thank you. And through the chair, I would invite Associate Superintendent Arts to speak to this hub model as he's been doing a lot of work in that area.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And through the chair, yeah, so the model is looking at 14 hubs with 28 elementary schools, so roughly 2 schools per hub. And we would be looking at proximity of school, distance from each other, as well as participation rates in the schools that are partaking. So we're just beginning to look through all of that, Cindy, so don't have the detailed answers at this time, but that's what the model would look like. Most likely looking at before or after school as the option for that time to happen in those hubs.
Thank you very much. Any other questions in relation to either the balancing recommendations or indeed the presentations? Trustee Kwan, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, just transitioning back to my home office from the car. I actually was just hoping to kind of ride on the tail end of Trustee Painter's question. And I wondered if we could perhaps just pick out in the options so that it's clear to everyone which actually community link items are being reduced and which are actually just completely being reallocated. Just to make it clear for everyone.
Thank you, Trustee Kwan. Secretary Treasurer, would you mind taking a minute and just guiding us to the appropriate page in the packet, and then we can perhaps follow along with you? I think it's on page 242 of the packet, where we start to see the community link related balancing recommendations. I just want to see if it continues at the page before. Yeah, so 242, folks. That's where it starts. Whenever you're ready, Secretary Treasurer.
Okay, we'll just work through this list from the top.
Sounds
So the behavior interventionist is not being reduced. What's happening with that one is the cost will be covered by inclusive learning. The GSA is a reduction out of community link, so it's going from 19,000 down to 10,000. The PICE, it says reallocate, but I believe it's actually a reduction. However, it might say reallocate because I believe that we have people who are trained in the schools to provide this. So maybe it's more of a shift in contracting with PICE to doing that in-house, but I look to others who know more about that one. It's compass stabilization says reallocate. That's actually a reduction. That one should say reduce. The next one is reduce social emotional learning, mental health. That is a reduction of 5,000 from 10, so it's reducing it in half. The cost of living allowance for YFC, it says reallocate, and that's because schools receive community link funding for YFCs. So for the cost of living allowance for them, so if there's any inflationary adjustment, that will come out of the allocation that schools receive. So not a reduction. This is sharing costs. The TTOC support to elementary schools was a temporary decision, so it's a reduction. And the enrollment contingency is a reduction. So I think the only one that needs correction is compass stabilization, should actually say reduce. Is that right? Also, just to clarify too, where the PICE, so we will not be hiring PICE. So it's a reduction in that contract service with them. So we will have to look to other ways that we would provide that.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I think that was very helpful. Trustee Painter, go ahead. You had a follow-up?
Different question this time, Chair. I think I just heard the Associate Secretary Treasurer mentioning that when evaluating the hub model, there would be consideration of current participation rates. Was that correct?
Yes, through the chair, that is correct. That's one of the factors we'd be looking at.
Yeah, that's great. Makes perfect sense. I'd been interested in getting a look at those numbers in the past. Would it be possible to get those for Thursday?
I can do my best to get that for Thursday.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Associate Superintendent Arts, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we do have some data, perhaps that was already provided in relation to the number of schools, elementary schools participating. I don't know if that gives us student numbers underlying that, but certainly we did have some information about the number of elementary schools participating in strings, which perhaps we can put into the pack-up or provide.
Through the chair, that is correct. We have that for sure. One of the factors that I was sort of alluding to is if it turned out that two schools had really large participation rates in strings, it may be too large for those two to be combined in a hub. It's just something that we want to look at, historic rates. So that I can see if I can put together, but the schools that are participating, absolutely, we can get that for Thursday, no problem.
Thanks very much. Okay, so any other questions in relation to the presentations and the balancing recommendations? Trustee Kwan, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, one more, and again, to do with the elementary strings hub, and kind of piggybacking off of Cindy Romp's question too, with just regarding, I think what we've heard a lot from concerned parents and community members is about equitable access. And so when we move to a hub, maybe students who aren't able to afford or access music programs without having them at a school are the ones who might be left behind because they aren't able to travel to a hub. And I just wondered if any thought had been put into, how we might do that, or how we would look at positioning the hubs to make it more equitable for students who actually do need to be able to access music through schools.
Thank you, Trustee Kwan. Associate
Yes,
Superintendent.
Thank you through the chair. Yes, Trustee Kwan, that is something that we are looking at and considering when we look at this model. We're really at the infancy of looking at it, but those are all factors that we are trying to put in play.
Thank you both. And again, we're going to have an opportunity on Thursday to discuss this in greater detail in the context of the motions coming forward then around music. Any other questions in terms of, again, the presentations and also the balancing recommendations? And again, it's first. Hi, Sarah. Go ahead when you're ready. Again, nice to see you as well.
Hi, thanks. Nice to see you, Trustee Duncan. I think curiosity, and I recognize this has been a challenging process for everyone behind the scenes, and everybody's going to feel the pinch as we go through balancing a deficit budget. But had two curiosities behind the scenes around how our students have become accustomed with the devices of having a 2-to-1 ratio and the pressures it may put to our PACs to maintain that ratio if we decrease it as a school district. We found through the pandemic, devices definitely help our kids and will impact their learning and their success as we reduce that back. And Community Link, my other curiosity and question was, yeah, I see how those all fit in Community Link, but overall that means the pot's a bit smaller. And so for those of us who priority schools who rely on that Community Link funding to support our schools, there may be some stretches for us as we go forward. So just some curious questions for you to think about. Thank you so much for your hard work.
Thank you very much. No, appreciate those questions. Yeah. Yeah, certainly the issue around devices and device ratios has come up, and I imagine will come up again. And we did see it as a considerable amount of investment, both provincially and federally, in student devices throughout COVID. And so that's left us with a surplus of devices, certainly more devices than we would normally have been operating with. And so it is certainly, something we've become used to, but certainly it's something that occurred during the COVID years. And I guess the question for us, and one of the challenges, is if we were to maintain those ratios that were built up during those COVID years of investment, how would we do that with the operating funding that we receive? And so, yeah, it is challenging. And it's the same thing with supplies. At some point, it does become a question of, do you reduce staffing, or do you reduce things like travel and supplies and Pro-D because you want to maintain staffing? So none of it is easy and none of it is ideal. Of course, we all wish it was. Superintendent, Secretary, Treasurer, I wanted to open the floor up if you had any initial thoughts or comments in relation to those observations and wonderings.
The only thing that I would mention is that we have had some conversations with the director of IT around device ratios, and if there was a supported ratio by the board, how we might be able to operationalize that. So all of the devices that we have different sort of ages on them. And so there would be quite a process that they would have to go to look at the devices that are at each of the schools, and obviously not go in and pull out a school's all of the school's devices and leave them with nothing. Essentially, they would have to look at how they could perhaps pull devices from other schools to ensure that the ratio is maintained across all schools. One of the other things that we discussed as well is, if we are supporting a certain device ratio, would we consider that that's the ratio and that we wouldn't want to have support from PACs to increase the devices in the school, but perhaps use funding for something else instead? Obviously each PAC has its own abilities to fundraise and provide supports to schools. So we wouldn't want to be in a position where certain schools don't have those resources to up the devices to 2.1 again, or whatever it happens to be at that school, where others can. And so those are things that we've definitely thought about, and I'm not exactly sure how that would be operationalized, but certainly not things we haven't considered.
Secretary Treasurer Superintendent, did you want to add something further?
Yeah, thank you. And just speaking on behalf of the community link, the point is well noted. When resources are reduced, there is an impact. The one thing that we have benefited from is the Feeding Futures input of funds. And so we know that we will get those again for next year. And so that has allowed for food to be supported through that mechanism versus the community link funding, which in the past has paid for the food. So we are fortunate to receive the Feeding Futures funds and kind of use or utilize community link funding differently. Again, not suggesting that any reduction is an easy one, but with the Feeding Futures, that has alleviated some of the pressures.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the question. I wonder if we could just for a moment back up a little bit to the presentation that the Secretary Treasurer gave in terms of enrollment projections. So we saw the projection for this year's enrollment and then the actuals. And I think it was just over 400 additional students that we didn't project or didn't anticipate receiving. And obviously that puts a lot of pressure on receiving schools when we have a steady influx of new students to welcome into our buildings. I'm wondering if we anticipate that we will see that occur again this year. I know we do our very best to project, but I also know that it's becoming increasingly complex in a world where there's a lot of other decision makers and factors that are outside of our control and that are difficult to project with increased immigration, new families coming to Canada and settling in Victoria, and some of the other sort of housing related initiatives that we know our partners provincially, municipally, and federally are going to be supporting. Do we have a sense of the potential impacts and how well we're positioned again to if that enrollment increases or spikes in a way that we don't anticipate?
I won't speak necessarily to the impacts right away, but I will mention that that increase that we saw this past year was tied to ministry funded international students and also refugee or like newcomers. And so one thing we were a little bit conservative about in this upcoming year, the changes that the federal government made around work permits and study permits and how that might impact families coming into Canada where the parents are studying at college or university and then their students are attending schools. So we did reduce, I believe 35% if I remember correctly, because that was sort of the percentage that they had thrown out in the media, just to be a little conservative on that. So if there are no impacts at our local institutions, our post-secondary institutions, we could see that number slightly higher than what we've projected. As to the readiness of our schools, I won't speak to that part, but perhaps someone else can.
Yeah, I can begin and then invite others to join in. I think that's something that well, really all year, but particularly at this time of the year that we're very cognizant of where our numbers are sitting and what we're doing in order to prepare for September. We're just entering into the staffing piece, which means we are collecting numbers from schools and appropriately supporting by divisions and classes. And so that is something that we are monitoring, and we have historical data on how many students come in as the year progresses in different areas of the district. So we're knowledgeable about that and make the best plans that we can based on that information, as well as information we have coming in from the different municipalities. So it is certainly something we're paying attention to now and trying to get ready for September.
Thank you both. Sorry, did I interrupt someone? I thought I heard a voice. Associate Superintendent Arts, did you want to add anything? No, okay. Okay, no, thank you very much. Appreciate that, you sharing that kind of additional context. It's certainly something I think that's on our minds, and certainly as a potential risk and a concern, it's something for us to consider moving forward. Okay, so the only other thing I really wanted to just pause and just look at and maybe have a little bit of discussion before we move on is around the actual funding increase that we saw of 3.4%. In per pupil funding, and then the comment that it's largely tied to the labor settlement funding. And so I'm just wondering if, well, when there's a couple of, I guess, areas of question still. So around the funding against the COLA for administrators. And I'm wondering kind of when we're going to hear like a final thumbs up, final approvals from the ministry.
We've had some indication that it will be supported, but of course, we don't usually do anything with that until we receive it in writing. When we listened to the funding announcement in mid-March, I believe they had hoped to have it out by the end of April.
End of April, okay. All right, well, we'll look to that. Thank you very much. And then the only other thing I think would be useful to take the opportunity to just highlight and discuss a little bit is around surplus. So over the years, we have seen a decline in surplus. And so there's on the one hand, that's a good news story in that we're using this year's funding for this year's students more and more. On the other hand, we are also seeing a decline in our contingency and escalating costs related to inflationary pressures in particular. And when we looked at the services and supplies budget, I think if I was understanding it correctly, we're projecting that not to see the same level of inflationary pressures related to services and supplies in the coming year. Am I understanding that correctly?
Just to clarify your question, that I'm not sure if you're asking if we are anticipating that we will have escalated costs.
I'm wondering whether we are anticipating the same level of escalating costs in relation to services and supply budgets.
I haven't received any indication that costs are going down, at least from my experience. As noted in the presentation, we did add in some additional budget for unavoidable increases that were related, I guess you could call them inflationary. So software costs in particular can be quite large. Yeah, I also see Julie has her hand up, so she may have a better answer.
Sounds great. Thank you. Associate Secretary Treasurer, go ahead.
Through the chair. So yes, we did build in inflationary increases for software renewals, service contracts, and custodial supplies. But all other budgets are status quo. I mean, the expectation is that costs will be going up, but we don't really have a budget to fund. So everyone's just going to have to work with less.
Okay, that helps a lot to clarify the areas where we're anticipating further cost escalations, but on the whole, we've budgeted for a status quo situation. Got it. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Okay, I just want to circle back to everyone around the virtual table tonight to see if anyone else has any other questions or wonderings before we move into deliberations. Yes, President Turquat, Ilda, so nice to see you. Go ahead when you're ready.
Yeah, thank you. And it seems I'm having some issues with my camera this evening, so apologies for that. So as I've been looking through the various areas of the budget and the cuts to services to our students, the reductions in services to our students, and if the board has made a contingency for increased costs due to some of these reductions in terms of perhaps some work-safe claims or folks going on leaves of absences or medical leaves as, you know, the reduction to student services is going to impact what is happening in classes and in the school. So just wondering if there's been any thinking around you know, costs that are going to arise from these reductions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Secretary, Treasurer, Superintendent, do you have any thoughts in terms of impacts of some of the reductions as it relates or as they relate to student services in particular?
I think as we look to this, we're talking about school-based inclusive learning funding, and we will look to push out the maximum amount that we can. We do have increased enrollment as well as increased number of students with a ministry designation. So I think as we move forward, the allocations, they may not be less than what they're currently in place for this year. So it's difficult to itemize that. I think that every year we're looking to try and provide the maximum support we can by pushing that funding out into schools. So I think we're always connecting or looking to connect with school-based teams and school-based principals and vice principals about their needs as they come forward and as they evolve. So that practice will continue and as we look, I think you were speaking about the 1.6 reduction that will be spread across schools. I think we always recognize a reduction as an impact, and then we look to how do we minimize or mitigate that impact through conversations and through shifting practices and different ways of providing support.
Thank you, Superintendent. Ilda, did you have a question in relation to any particular line item that you wanted us to speak to? Or did the superintendent anticipate and identify already the line item that you were particularly interested in?
Yes, thank you. No, that was great. Thanks. I appreciate that response. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Gagnon, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. What President Turcotte kind of triggered something in my brain to ask that we've seen over the past few years, the budget for TTOCs rise substantially, unmatched by provincial funding. I haven't seen what we're projecting for 2024, 2025 in the budget. So I was just wondering if that data is available, just to see what we are expecting for TTOC expenses next year.
Thank you very much, Trustee Gagnon. Secretary Treasurer, I know we've had unbudgeted increases over the last couple of years, but has that been built into the budget?
Yes, we did build extra in because we've had to put in final budget amounts between 1 and 2 million each time. And so I would actually defer to Julie to identify what that number was, because I don't know it off the top of my head.
Sounds good. Thank you. Associate Secretary Treasurer, when you're ready.
Yes, we increased the average number of days per teacher to 13.8 from 10.1 last year, to account for the increased cost. That's where it's trending currently this year.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Trustee Gagnon, for the question. Okay, I'm just going to circle back one more time to the group before I move us into deliberations. Any more questions in relation to any of the memos or the reports, or indeed the balancing recommendations? Okay, I don't see any hands. So thank you everybody for your questions this evening and your participation. We appreciate it. Trustees, I am going to move us into C8. So this is our budget bylaw readings. Our intention this evening was to do first and second reading. We'll see how we get on. But the first recommended motion is that the Board of Education of School District Number 61, Greater Victoria, 2024-2025 annual budget bylaw in the amount of 318,006,345 be read a first time the 9th day of April 2024. So may I have a mover, and then we'll move into some discussion. Thank you, Trustee Mabobi, and a seconder. May I have a seconder? This is just to get us into discussion. Thank you, Trustee Gagnon. Okay, so before we launch into discussion, I probably should stop myself and just check in with our partners around the table this evening. If there is anything that you wanted to add in relation to the recommended motion before trustees launch into our deliberations. Yeah, go ahead, Ilda.
Oh, thank you. I'm just going to say how concerned I am with the reductions to the budget in relation to our counselors, learning support teachers. All these cuts, reductions impact our most vulnerable learners, and I'm very concerned about that.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands, so I'm going to turn to trustees for some discussion in relation to the recommended motion. Yeah, Trustee McNally, you can kick us off. Go ahead.
Thank you. As always, I'm concerned with many of the reductions that do impact students. It's always an offloading from the ministry to school boards to face this agony, really. But I'm just going to bring up one thing. There's just so much to focus on. When I look at, a $6 or a $4 million deficit on one hand, and the disruption to the music program for a savings of, I think, $137,000. I just can't support that. I know we'd have to find $137,000 or, a similar amount somewhere else, but yeah, I just think that one's not worth the reorganization and the cut. So, I mean, just for that, and also for we've in the past, and I've been here for a few terms now. In the past, we've had discussions around, are we stewards or are we advocates? Are we stewards who do the best we can with the pittance that we get from the ministry? Or are we advocates who strongly object to the ongoing underfunding? So those are things that are rambling through my mind, but I can't support this, the music upheaval for that amount of savings, and probably not at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee McNally. Any other trustees? Trustee Kwan, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would definitely second, first of all, what President Turcotte said, and again, what my colleague, Trustee McNally, is saying. There are some things on this, that are really, really hard to sit with. They don't leave a good feeling
anywhere on my body, but especially in my stomach right now. You know, I think counselors, inclusive learning, you know, those are big ones. So I guess the question for me is and for kind of in response to Trustee McNally too, is where else are we going to find this? You know, I guess, you know, I look to my colleagues to see if there's, you know, if there's any suggestions on, you know, perhaps where we could, you know, look or if there's any, you know, any ambition to kind of look into, you know, where we might be able to find some savings elsewhere or, you know, some revenues elsewhere in order to make up this budget. You know, I think that's the whole point is it's, again, are we stewards or are we advocates? And I mean, I think we're both at this point. You know, we do have a fiduciary duty as well. But I think the point is that, you know, when we look at what we're funded for and what those contractual ratios are, you know, that's all paper stuff. But when we look at the schools, we all here know that those ratios don't mean a whole lot when it comes to our kids, and we know what we need. And you know, I think really that's where we're going is, you know, looking for that additional funding. We need to get that additional funding in order to bring those contractual rates up. And I think we all have to do our part. And I think as trustees, we have to do our part as well. Yeah, just leaving that there. I think it's food for thought. We're obviously not going to be approving everything tonight. So perhaps it's something we can think over in the next couple of days. And when we come back on Thursday, maybe we can have more discussion about, I don't know.
Thank you, Trustee Kwan. Okay, so subject to any other discussion in relation to the first bylaw reading, are we ready to call the question? I just might offer some food for thought, and that is, you know, something that was highlighted in the memo from the Secretary Treasurer around the increase in per pupil funding being 3.4%, really mainly tied to the labor settlement, and you know, not having seen any really meaningful increase to per pupil funding. You know, in BC, we still are lagging behind and we're still below the national average in terms of that investment. So there is a lot of advocacy work that we need to do. And I think while we are undoubtedly governors and we have legislative obligations that mean we have to pass a balanced budget, we also have been elected to advocate for public education, and to advocate for public education means that we have to advocate for adequate and stable funding. So every year we're in this situation, it seems, where we don't have enough funding and we're agonizing over every line item, looking for savings, reallocating funds. So it's by no means an easy job. No one likes to see cuts to areas that we know will have an impact on classrooms. There does come a point where year after year, as we look for cuts and creative solutions, we start to run out of options. This year, I know we have tried to look at budgets like supplies, like protein travel, to try to minimize any kind of staffing cuts. However, it is very challenging when the ratios of the ministry funds are not fully supporting the kind of learning environments that we want to offer. We see that in counseling, I think, is a really good area that demonstrates this, where, you know, the board is investing additional funds above and beyond what we're funded for from the ministry. But yeah, it's not an ideal situation. It's very difficult and it creates a lot of stress in the system. And we're hearing that from folks around the table this evening. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, but also acknowledge the fact that we do indeed need to pass a balanced budget, and how we get there is complex and difficult. If we do pass a reading tonight, one or two, and there are solutions that folks want to raise and bring to the table on Thursday. I just want to circle back with the Secretary Treasurer, just process-wise, that would not be problematic, that we could in fact do first and second reading tonight if the board wishes, and have a proposal or more than one proposal on the 11th. What's the process?
Yeah, the budget bylaw allows for quite a bit of flexibility there, so we were looking for a certain dollar amount in order to balance. So you could absolutely make changes within that to other items or change amounts, and it would still be fine to do the third reading on Thursday. Even if the number does change, it's still fine. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, trustees, so you understand then kind of where we at process-wise and the flexibility that we have if a solution does come to the table that we want to consider between now and Thursday when we come back together again. Does anybody have any questions? Just brief. Yeah, go ahead, Trustee McNally.
Sorry, it's not a question, it's just a quick historical note. On one of the talking tables reports, there was one statement saying, trustees, you should be writing letters to the ministry and demanding better funding. And I just want, that individual and all people who may not have been involved for, as long as over the years that I have, we have presented needs budgets alongside of our actual budget to demonstrate to the ministry how far away from real service, ideal service to our kids, the promises that we make and can't keep, how far away that is from what the ministry gives us. And we've written countless letters, and I'm sure they go in the round file. So just to let everybody out there know, we have tried and we continue to.
Thank you, Trustee McNally. Okay, folks. Trustee Kenya, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Just noting something that you had mentioned about providing the funding for what we want to offer, and I don't think we're anywhere near providing the funding for what we want to offer. We're barely at funding for what we are legally required to offer by the province at this point, and the requirements keep going up. So the funding stays the same, the requirements go up, and we're just expected to crack on and make do. And the people that suffer are the students of our school district, it's the staff of our school district, and it's the families of our school district. It's pretty much nonsense at this point to even consider that the funding model is anywhere near adequate. It's not. I encourage anyone and anybody to advocate to your MLAs. It is an election year, but as Trustee McNally said, this has fallen on deaf ears for a long time. And it's unfortunate because it's clear that this isn't a priority for the government in power. And I am dismayed that we are in this position. And then looking at the pack-up at page 263 of the multi-year financial forecast, it's coming again next year, and it's coming again the year after. This isn't like the cuts. We finally did it, and we solved the problem. The cuts are going to keep coming until the funding gets better, and we just it's not good enough. That's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Kenya. Okay, so I'm just turning to my colleagues. If anyone would like to speak to the motion, the recommended motion before I call the question. Okay, so I'm going to call the question. So again, we're voting on the first reading of the recommended motion, which is the bylaw. All those in favor, first reading with a show of hands. If you just leave your hands up because I'm switching between two screens. Thank you. Okay, all those opposed? And abstentions. Okay, can I just get the folks with that are opposed to just raise your hands one more time? Okay, so we have Trustee Gagnon, Trustee McNally, and Trustee Mabobi opposed, and the balance in favor. Thank you very much, folks. Okay, so I'm looking to my board colleagues. Do we want to do a second reading? And if so, would someone like to move that? The Board of Education of SD61, Greater Victoria. And I'm sorry, Secretary Treasurer, should it be approve the 2024-2025 annual budget bylaw? Or no, just how it is?
Yeah, it's just how it is. It's
Okay.
that the bylaw be read is how it's worded. If you skip out
Sorry,
all
I'm
the
trying to do this
numbers.
on a phone.
So yeah, it's okay as written.
Okay. Okay, read second time, the 9th day of April 2024. Would someone like to move that second reading? Do I have a mover? No? Okay, so we're going to move second. I'm going to take that as if we don't have a mover, then I take that we're going to move second reading on Thursday. Okay, so that brings us to question period. So just give me a moment. I'm just going to have a look to see what we've got. Okay. Okay, so I think we've got a question here. So I think that there were a few questions from one of the individuals that submitted questions for question period. Our budget bylaw allows only one question per individual. So we've just selected the first question from that individual, which is, how was the decision made to set the ratio of devices at secondary schools at 3:1? My own child's experience at secondary school was that many students brought their own devices. I was just wondering why a ratio isn't set for each school. I would expect that some schools in the district have more pronounced need for devices than other schools. I'm just going to turn to the superintendent.
Yeah, thank you. And through the chair, if we could be able to take that away and then reply back as per the bylaw and likely back to the Thursday meeting as well.
Certainly. Thank you, Superintendent. Okay, we have, let's see. Turning to staff, was that all the questions that we had under question period, or were there any additional questions submitted?
To the chair, that is all the questions that were submitted.
That was it? Okay. All right, thanks. I just wanted to make sure we didn't miss anything. Thanks very much, Associate Superintendent Arts. Okay, we are now at that time in our time together this evening where I will look for a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Trustee McNally, and seconded by Trustee Bio. All those in favor with a show of hands? And that is unanimous. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you again on Thursday evening. Take care.